Let's just get the definition of attempted overview clarified from the very beginning. I am only giving brief reviews of English long form fanfiction, works with 60k words minimum. I am not focusing on one shots and short stories since I usually don't read them. You'll have to get your takes on those somewhere else. Wait! I would think that the odds are that you're likely aware of Fate simply by clicking on this video. Perhaps you clicked on the video by general curiosity. Fate is the general series of works that stemmed from a visual novel called Fate Stay Night. The property as a whole has a whole plethora of visual works, but in general, especially when it comes to the realm of Fate fanfiction, the only works that one really needs to enjoy are Fate Stay Night, Fate Zero, and Fate Granddaughter, as those are the ones that actually usually get fanfiction. The first two works are relatively simple to get through. FGO, however, I will admit, is a bit of a time investment. My recommendation, since you shouldn't want to waste money on a shit gacha, would be to open up one of the NA Let's Plays on YouTube, set the speed between 1.25 and 1.6, and skip all the combat and just read the dialogue. If you want to read all of the main stories and side events, it will probably take a couple months to get through it. If you only want the main story, you could probably cut the time in half. The choice is up to you, but the events are where some of the peak FGO content happen. Skipping Grail Live will qualify you for cruel and unusual punishment. You can find most translations of everything JP side right up to Ordeal Stall 3 on YouTube as well, which is when the new FGO policy kicked in and forbids gameplay from being posted of basically all of Ordeal Crawl. Now, technically, you could just read some FGO fanfictions, which could probably get you a similar experience in a short amount of time. I would, however, call this bitch behavior and tell you that the 2,000 plus part Let's Play is mandatory. Also, most FGO fics, unless they specifically start later in part 2, never reach that far, and thus inherently don't show later characters that are introduced that much. So if you actually want to enjoy the full grasp of FGO, you'll have to consume the official material eventually. Also, knowing the original story can help show the interesting differences and improvements some fanfic writers make in some of the singularities and plot beats, especially with some of the beginning less well-written ones. Now, like I said in the beginning, I am only focused on 60k plus ongoing or completed works. A massive problem in Fate fanfiction that I've noticed in the 4+ years I've been reading, one that unfortunately is common with fanfics in general, are stories going on hiatus. I won't mention stories currently on hiatus here, my specific definition being stories that haven't gotten an update in 2024 or are officially stated to be on hiatus. While there is a legitimate argument to be made that perhaps it might be better to know of good past old hiatus works with the accelerated improvement of AI story writers, which already exist in a guided manner, which could give continuations and endings to these dead stories, I feel like it would add more onto an already full-played stories to get through, so I will not be touching upon them. Perhaps for another video. Let's start from the worst and work our way up. I'll briefly put on screen all of the Fate stories that I've dropped that I read even a noticeable margin of that I remember. Pause if you wish. First up are the mid stories. The ones I deem the 6 out of 10s, barely passable, but not bad enough to drop. There's 3 stories right off the bat that I can think of as mid, notably grouped together due to the fact that they are written by the same person, Nim the writer, those being a fake familiar reborn, lyrical sword, and an archer's promise. A fake familiar is like you would get from the summary, Archer in high school DxD as the main love interest for Rios, who he's contracted to, so Issei likely doesn't hook up with her. I haven't really kept up to date for a year now. Take that as whatever statement of its quality as you wish. Lyrical Sword is Shiro transported into the magical girl Lyrica Nanoha universe, where he comes to work with Nanoha and others. It suffers from the same amateurish, at times cringy, writing style as the rest of Nim's work, as well as being exclusive to FF.net, a site which email notice didn't work for almost half a year, until the middle of writing this video. Finally, there's An Archer's Promise, which is what I would consider his best work that I read for a couple years, in which I rated a 7 out of 10, up until relatively recently with the start of the new art, which I felt fell a bit in quality with more cringy moments at times. It basically is Archer thrown into Kuruinu, that show that was known before Redo of Healers but after Rants. If you see the art, you instantly recognize it in some capacity, assuming you got into anime in the early 2010s. It more or less is kind of a fix-it-fic, but not full-blown in the kind of self-indulgent direction. Overall, Nim suffers a lot from what I feel is amateurish writing, some of which is inherently just kind of cringy story progression, but others are more immediate fixable issues like the use of sound words in the stories, or lack of detail about the surroundings which can make the story environment feel like a white background. It's not unreadable, but it certainly makes it so I'd only recommend their work if you really have a lot of spare time and want to read as much passable Fate stuff as you can. Fate Shadow Spear is a complete fic I read a few years back that involves Skaha, specifically her involved in training Shiro before the events of Fate's Day Night. Suffers from some misspellings and some amateurish writing style, with a decent chunk of telling instead of showing, and I remembered very little of it beyond being that fic that Sky trained Shiro. If you like Sky or want only complete stories, perhaps give this a shot, but otherwise there's probably others you can focus on first. Fate Hero and Sword is a story where the background is that Shiro played Yggdrasil and had made NPCs of a lot of servants, which became real when he was also shunted into the game. Personally, I haven't felt the desire to catch back up since reading it last over 2 years ago, which I'm not sure is due to my lack of love for the original Overlord source material, or due to the plot so far. If you're a fan of Overlord, perhaps you might enjoy this more. Fate Sword Order is another story by the same author I decided to catch up a bit for this video, having last touched it almost 3 years ago. It essentially has Shiro as a master Claudia, with emphasis placed on Shiro unwittingly wooing some of the servants in the process of going through singularities. Due to this kind of cringy development, as well as the fact that in 4 years the author has only gotten to near the Septim singularity, 2 out of 7, I am extremely hesitant to recommend this in any regard. Fate Kill is another yet again by the same author that I decided to finally finish for this video. It's a complete story involving Shiro reincarnated into the offensive of Gami ga Kill, where he goes on to become Emperor. I would say it's about a 6.5. Not as much cringe Shiro harem protag as some of his other works, but still holds the amateurish writing that pops up from time to time. If you want to revisit Akame ga Kill, perhaps this might be for you. Percy Jackson in the Far Side Mood is, as you might have guessed, a Fate Extra across the Percy Jackson, with what seems to be BB simulating the Percy Jackson universe to use for a Holy Grail War as a game. To be quite blunt, this story is kind of schizo-y in its writing, and seems like it assumes you are extremely familiar with the various series set in the Percy Jackson universe. Overall, I'm heavily considering dropping it and couldn't recommend. Saberfest is either between a 6 or a 7. It has some amateurish / cringy writing alongside very sparse updates as of the last couple of years, which I haven't felt the desire to catch up on. Story is about, as you could guess, a Grail War with a ton of saber faces. Crappy at times from what little I remember, and the brief skim I did of it. Unfortunately, don't have the time or patience to reread for this video to pinpoint the story, too chunky. Continuation of the End is a fic where a couple of characters gain the memories of some people from Fate HA, mainly focusing on Basset. The writing is kind of mid to find at best, and it has a slow update rate to say the least. But it did release another update during the finishing up of this video. I personally haven't kept up with it for almost a year and a half now. Perhaps give us a glance if you like Lizette, since she's underutilized in fics. Otherwise, other stories you could focus on first. Why does this yandere look like my mother? Is basically an OC kid of a Sakura and Shiro, and one day BB basically causes the apocalypse. The story and the writing is mid, with there not being really any adult content I can recall, and the author has an issue of never finishing his works and hasn't touched his story since February, which has me questioning the realistic likelihood of him coming back and finishing this. Overall, can't recommend. Fate Oracle is essentially a Fate reactive, but with a bit more effort put into it than the average. Unfortunately, it's still kind of mid, and wouldn't have been here without an out-of-the-blue update this year with little indication on it making a complete comeback. On top of that, the story is focused more on the individual characters of Fate Stay Night reacting, so nothing really that unique either. I personally got more enjoyment out of the handful of public alternative chapters, which had a reveal to the whole world. But they unfortunately didn't actually go in on the world trying to get involved in these events either. Can't really recommend. The Fallen is a story of an Emiya Alter Lily, as said by the author, who gets into Ruby and starts going around killing Salem's cult. Its prose are the character chosen, as well as the slight AU elements that spice things up. However, it's held back by amateur writing, dialogue, and grammar issues which put it at a flat 6, maybe a 6.5 if I'm really generous. If you want a story about Emiya Alter, perhaps give us a glance, otherwise there's other stuff you could try first. How I Saved History is a completed, relatively short and quick SI fic, going over the events of FGO Part 1. It has its flaws, as some very loud critics would share, those being its MC, whom can be a bit of a jackass who jumps to extreme actions unnecessarily, as well as shoddy writing, which can lead to out-of-character behavior by some of the cast, as well as the general short writing. I personally feel like the story is acceptable if you aren't being uber autistically nitpicky about character inconsistencies and treat it more jokingly / cracky, and feel it makes up with the attempt at some original ideas and characters they write, as well as the ending, which has been described as Monty Python-esque, which I personally found great and still remember to this day. Overall, 6.5 out of 10. Fate Centennial is another complete short story, taking place during Arthurian times, where Morgan and Arturia respectively summon servants and duke it out similar to a Puck. The main issue of this fic is the writing, which, as opposed to some fanfics which have an issue of being composed of short one-line sentences, is the opposite, with a bunch of paragraphs that are not spaced out, which causes one's eyes to glaze over in the process of reading. The other real point is the shortness of it, with it going over events that could have probably been done in way more detail. The pros are its relative uniqueness and plot ideas and some of the details it gives, which for me put it at 6.5. No higher, however. The new staff of Beacon Academy is a complete story involving Shekel, summoned as the servant of Amber, and taking up position in Beacon. I would say after finishing it, it's either 6 or 7, but I'm not sure which I would choose. The latter half of the story I caught up with was fine for the most part, outside of some misspellings, but I remember issues with writing and misspellings which made me initially stop keeping up to date with the story to begin with prior to this video. Overall verdict of not bad, but would hesitate to recommend unless you are a fan of Shekel. Humanity's Last Counselor is a episodic fic for the most part, with Hachiman as the last master of Claudia. It's not really that well written at times, but it actually does more of the character interaction side of Claudia, instead of the standard singularity action stuff, which is always a breath of fresh air. Overall, at least a 6.5, if not a 7, and an okay recommendation if you are a fan of Snafu. Spin a Fate is a fusion fic of Spider-Man and Marvel in general crossed at FGO, with Peter taking the position of the Master of Claudia. Story has some amateurs writing, a bit of annoying behavior by Peter, and is bogged down due to the writing assuming you are a fan of Marvel, and thus it thinks that you know some of the characters it references. Overall, I would say it's either 6 or 6.5 and no higher. The main issue that prevents me from recommending this is that the story has been around for over 3.5 years, and we haven't completed a French Singularity yet. If it was coming out with consistent content and chugging along, perhaps I would be more willing to recommend it. It has a comic side story called Last Bit of Red on the FTO subreddit. Roasting People Isn't a Firework is a story of Hans reincarnated into MHA. It does suffer from some amateur writing, but my main issue is me not liking the metaphoric wall breaking that happens occasionally, as well as being iffy on whether Hans here is actually written to how Hans is an FGO. Granted, this may be my own issue. I may not have the best grasp on Hans, and this truly is him. Either way, though, the story is not one I'm too invested in. Overall, 6.5 for me. The main praise point is calling it the one Hans fic I'm aware of. Lord of Swords is a Shiro into Percy Jackson AU that, as of now, seems to be focused on a plot with Shiro getting together with an Artorio of this world. The writing is amateurish and has various grammar issues, but it does get some credit for originality. I put it at 6.5. Maybe if you're a fan of Rick's series, give it a look. Otherwise, there's better stories to read first. Timeless Academia is a prime example that even if you have great technical writing, it can still be handicapped due to characters, or in this case, Izuku, as the Master Arcadia, who, as you would expect, starts with the issue of being unwilling to kill. What you may not expect, however, is for that to be a permanent thing, or at least it was for 209 chapters I read of it last year. The story has its own original characters, changes to singularities and plot, but all this is hindered due to the insufferable nature of Deku, and in general, brings down my enjoyment of the story to a 6.5 or 7 at best, and I haven't bothered to keep up with it since last year. If you're able to handle Deku's stubborn non-killing creed and the complications it brings, you might find this decent or good. Otherwise, there are other stories to choose before this. The 7 out of 10s, the ones I would call just fine. Anomaly is a fic where the events of Gate happen in Fate, where Shiro is in Tokyo as it goes down, and drama goes from there. The starting chapters are kind of mid, but the semi-interesting story, as well as the more realistic portrayal that JSDF has me give it a 7. Some issues with misspelling or writing, but overall fine if nothing special. Mage in the Machine is a fusion fic with fake characters inside Arcane. It's fine overall, both the writing and the plot, but since it's a fusion fic, I'm kind of just okay on the story as well, at least for now. If a more interesting plot comes to fruition, I will likely increase my rating, but as of now, it's just considered one of those fics I'll read if I feel like it. Cardia Evil Incorporated is a fusion fic with Hines and Perry as Masters of Cardia. I'm generally not a fan of cracky shit, but I feel like the story balances it right enough that it's not insufferable and it's actually enjoyable at times. It does suffer from amateur writing, grammar issues, and the lack of substantial original twists/ideas outside of Toka, alongside other smaller issues at times, which lead me to put it at either a flat 7 or 7.5. If you want something that's usually more community focused, perhaps this might be up your alley. Tale of a Cruel World is a fic where Shiro pre-SN gets shunted into Terraria, where he is essentially labeled a hero and has to work to get stronger to survive this world. It's fine, but it's very much popcorn, and not really anything of real note. If you want something to more or less turn your brain off to, this is the fic to choose. Incarnations of Legend is essentially a fic where a bunch of servants are put into Danmachi, and the story is kind of a narrative focus on slowly revealing the effects the servants have had. Or at least that's what I remember from what I read 3 years ago, as I haven't touched it since then. Technically speaking, the writing is fine, maybe even decent, a click glance shows me, but I haven't personally been interested in catching up with this fic, so for me, your side's a 7. Perhaps you might have more enjoyment. After all, this is a sizable one with a lot to read if you enjoy Fate and Danmachi. Grand Gacha is a new ongoing fic that, as stated by the author, is centered around actually making the servants summoned noticeably affect the plot. Its pros are that it's relatively fast at the moment, makes use of game art and fan art to spice up the fic, and actually does what it says on tin. The cons are that the writing is amateurish, with a lot of one-line sentences and other issues, grammar mistakes occasionally, and some slight cringe very rarely. The author has shown to at least have consistency via their other two works, however, so come to the end of the year, they might actually be in the fourth singularity, which will be more points in their favor. But unless they start doing more than just having the same singularities with some changes due to new servants, I would have to say, while fine, there are other stories that do more than the bare minimum of plot that you'd be better off trying first. Draw All the Cards is a Fate x Ruby crossover where this OC, who is raised with Ruby and Yang, gets given these 7 servant cards that grant him powers to the servants they are supposed to be of, with the story slowly unveiling who they are. The writing and plot is just fine. There's not really anything too standoutish beyond the power premise and the servants chosen. And for me, who prefers the actual character interaction that come from the various servants affecting the world, this one inherently goes down in ranking just due to how the story keeps them in his mind. A Demon Keen's Affection is crossover with Rants involving a Prisma Ilya Shiro paired with Gale, who seek to take down the gods. I did consider putting this in mid, as there is some cliche / cringy character writing, but I think the overall uniqueness of the crossover, the story plot, and the Shiro version used made it deserving to be ranked as is. The only thing to note is that I came back from a hiatus of a little over 2 years with a new chapter, and it's debatable whether it is truly here to stay long term or simply going to be subject to another hiatus. Conflicting Ideals is a fic that involves Shiro and Rin being shunted into MHA with younger bodies. The writing is decent, but the fic has some plot choices as well as general overpoweredness of Shiro and Rin compared to most of the cast that honestly makes the story lack impact or stakes outside of a shoehorn in elements of fate to add in some more conflict. This wouldn't be a problem if the character interaction was good, but it's just fine, which is why it's in the slot. I would want to say I would recommend My Ideal Academia instead, as I consider it to be the better Shiro into MHA fic, but unfortunately it hasn't updated since October of 2023, so out of the scope of this video. The Queen of Shadows is a AU where the Masters of Caldia seek out whose master betraying to prepare for the inevitable showdown with Solomon. There is occasional amateurish writing, mainly written sound, some misspellings, but the story tries something unique, which is focused on giving history a Ska and doing a story centered around her. It's unfortunately not higher due to feeling like there's sometimes out of character moments for some of the cast, but if you're a Ska fan, you probably should at least give us a glance. Realm of Entwined Science and Sorcery Academy City is a complete fic with singularity encompassing Academy City from Tuoru Manjutsu no Index. It's just fine. It has some issues with too much omniscient POV narration style writing, which is off-putting, especially during the fight scenes, alongside instances of slight out-of-character moments from time to time, which make me hesitate to recommend it. If you're a fan of Index, perhaps give us a look, but otherwise nothing special. The Saga of Shiro Summons is essentially just a complete collection of what-ifs with Shiro summoning various different servants instead of Saber and Fate Stay Night. It's fine, don't really remember anything from it, however, which has led me to putting it here, despite it seemingly well written with nothing too cringy on a brief skim. Dragons Are Just Beer Swallows is a nice complete fic with Sasaki transferred into Ruby, specifically Rowan's body. It's kind of cracky, and while I generally don't like crack fics, this one isn't too immersion breaking, it's just right. Can't rate it any higher, however, due to the lack of seriousness that is rife throughout, however. Solid story, Death to Swallows. Tale of Two Canes Redux is a completed SI into the events of Fate Arthurian times, where he eventually becomes a king and hooks up with several girls. Decent story and smut, but the story can be kind of jumpy, an issue that can be found in some of Bukarin's other works, and I personally haven't thought about it once in 2 years since I last read it. If you want a story involving relationships and some political intrigue, this might be for you. The Huntsman of Red V2 is one I've been following for 4 years now. Archer summoned as the servant of Ruby during the grim attack she suffered as a child. The story builds and goes down the path of Archer interfering in events and changing things, and eventually deciding to engage in some mastermindery. Story's about a 7.5, between fine and decent, with the only real complaint I have for it being the author themselves, Percasius, who unfortunately is one of those types of authors, the ones who juggle a bajillion different stories. Granted, with the way the story is, there might be a chance of it actually finishing in another dozen or so chapters, so only about another year or so, but that might be wishful thinking on my part. Regardless, still a semi-decent story, especially like Ruby in general. Fate Reach Out is a fusion fic where Shiro and Persona 4 are combined and Shiro takes the part of the protagonist. I personally would rate this as maybe 7.5. While the author's a bit slow, they have been consistent writing this for over a decade now, and the story is interesting with little flaws to speak of beyond a few examples of shoddy writing style. Overall, semi-decent. Four Heroes Walk Into an Adventure is a story where the four protags of the main Fate stories, that being Fate Stay Night, Fate Extra, FGO, and Fate Prototype, are shunted into Damachi mainly, with no servants. The story idea is decent, though it seems like it might go the way as most multi-hop shit, which is on perma-hiatus, and until I see a confirmation on a legitimate end planned, as well as more content in general, I can't recommend it. The Sword Saint is a Fate route Shiro after the events of the Holy Grail War, who gets isekai to Damachi and becomes the child of Astrea, with a budding romance between the two. The story is fine to decent. Main critiques are just okay writing, and whether or not the story is actually going to continue on or go on hiatus like the vast majority of questionable Western stories. The story actually continues and throws in its own original ideas and progression. I could easily see us reach an 8 or an 8.5, but for now I'm putting it a 7.5. Assisting you and remembering you are two completed stories in a series going through parts 1 and 1.5 of FGO, which involve Romani getting romantically involved with an OC named Rui. It has some flaws, one being low-effort short combos during the Singularity events, misspellings, and some cringe in a couple instances, but overall a fine piece of work. 7.5. I'm not sure why these are the only long fics in existence that focus on cooking Leo. You would think there would be more fans of Roman, and inevitably more stories focusing on romancing Roman, but nope, this is the only one. Gets the unique stamp of story plot at least. Cup of Depresso is a more or less complete episodic story involving Archer manning the Claudia cafeteria, handing out various kinds of coffees to people and listening to their problems. It's more of the episodic slice of life stuff, and as such doesn't have too much long-term plot progression, which is why it's only a 7.5 for me personally. Still an okay read if you want something more snacking instead of beefy. The Grail's Dark Knight is a fusion fic where Batman seeks out Kiritsugu, which leads him into becoming a master of the Fourth Holy Grail War. Its noticeable standout is some fan art of both custom and AI variety, and the use of Dolphinki as his servant. The main con of it is the various grammar issues of it, but there is a couple of times with writing issues as well. Personally, I'm just on the fusion aspect of it, but I will admit that more work has gone into trying to make a convincing fusion cross than other things. These aspects, along with the fact I have a dislike for DC or Marvel in general, due to their overpowered characters, have me rated a 7.5, and the potential to reach an 8 if the author just decided to go through and fix the grammar issues. 8 out of 10s, the ones deserving of being called decent. Ruby and R is a fic where Ritika post lost belts with servant cards ends up in Ruby. It has some issues, such as amateurish writing, specifically some omniscient writing, as well as the current shoehorned 5-member team that Ruby fics like doing, but I feel that the enjoyment I get from the story so far, as well as the custom art, makes it worthy of getting a decent rating instead of something lower. We Dance Through Fire and Ice is a completed side story to fic Heroes of Man that is a crossover of Fate and Fire and Ice, which focuses on Ned and Artoria. Its main objective flaws are both the occasional grammar issue and it assuming that you are a fan of A Song in Ice and Fire, with it referencing names of tons of characters that, realistically, you can't really keep track of. Personally, despite it being technically well written, due to both the writing assuming your prior knowledge and the fact that none of the main characters are that interesting to me, I couldn't rate this any higher than an 8, and I only got around to completing it for this roundup. If you're a prior fan of the series, this might be a more appealing, otherwise it's only decent. Fate Crusade at Void's End is essentially a fic with Luis from Familiar Zero, who ends up becoming a master of Claudia. The story includes rewritten singularities, new servants, and some mysteries being hinted at with Luis's origin, as well as something being up with her as shown in the latest chapters. There are only 2 issues that prevent me from rating this higher, however. The first is grammar issues. It's not such a problem that it makes the story unreadable, but there's always at least one error every so often, which I feel should be noticeable upon a rereading the spot. If this was fixed, this will be raised to an 8.5 alone. The second issue is that, despite all the creativity in the story, there hasn't been any memorable highs that stick with me, and I had pretty much completely forgotten this fic until catching up on the last 4 chapters for this video. And even after getting refreshed, there still isn't anything that really comes back to mind. And for a story that isn't completed, there has to be something memorable in order to breach into the 9s and 10s for me. Fate Alternative is another story I decided to catch up with for this. A pretty straightforward isekai of a Shiro before the events of Fate's Day Night into Pathfinder, where over time, he collects a party and eventually meets Archer, who through his own story has gotten here as well. It's pretty decent. The main flaws are being inconsistent pacing as the biggest. The story does have an issue of glossing over the more slice of life aspects in favor of the action, which it spends a decent chunk of time on. Combined with this is the fact that it's technically only been a couple of months since Shiro got here, despite almost 500,000 words. So for me, this is more of a story I'll let build up over time before coming back to binge it again, rather than queuing up chapter by chapter. Wairda/Sundavar is a fic with Sakura and Ryder getting isekai into Aragon. The writing is pretty decent, though you can make the critique it follows the book events word for word a few times, even when it really shouldn't be the case. Personally, it's kind of held down by the choice in characters, who can be a bit boring to me personally, so it isn't any higher than an 8. Still decent all around, decent story all around, and is an example of a rare story that focuses on Sakura and Medusa. Black Dragon of Britain is a complete AU and has Ritika existing in Arthurian time, who eventually becomes the love of Arturia, who is the Lancer Alter Tyrant version. The writing is competent, technically without issue. However, there are 2 points that make me put it at an 8 or an 8.5 at best. That being one, the fact that the story could have been done with an OC entirely without doing the look-alike. And the second is that there was no memorable points from this story for me. I had essentially completely forgotten this story until I decided to reread it to get a score, and as such I couldn't personally rate it any higher despite it not having any real writing issues. Still a short completed story regardless, and of course taste may vary. Of Swords and Redemption is a custom Shiro reincarnated into Musoka Tensei. So far, it's pretty decent with a focus on more philosophical and family dynamics. I want to put it higher, but I feel like it's missing something I can't put my finger on to make it deserving of it. There is also the issue that while it's on AO3, it is several chapters ahead on FF, which can be annoying. Solid recommendation, hopefully it gets even better. Fate/True Bazaar is a completed fusion fic by Jay Bukharin, where Jotaro gets involved in the events of Fate Zero and gets a caster servant. I finished it up for this video, and it's solidly decent. A rec for anyone into JoJo and Fate. It has some overly anime writing at times, but it also makes up with some of the story progression and the servant chosen for Jotaro, whom is a rarely utilized character. It also has a complete sequel called Vinto Imperial, Gold and Purple, involving Sakura, although I haven't read it yet. The Emiya Grail War is a complete story involving different Shiros being summoned as servants, with them all having their own original backstory. Overall, solid concept, plot, and characters, but unfortunately it really deserved to be longer, as some of the characters got little screen time, and overall could have used more fleshed out character interactions, alongside with more substantial sentences and writing at times. Despite that, however, it's decent, and if you're looking for some what-if Shiros, this is your pick. 8 out of 10. To Grasp a Ring is another 8 out of 10 for me so far. a story with Shiro being shunted into the lands between, not as a tarnished, but regardless, going on a journey after he died due to a little trolling by Ilya. It's really solid, the only issues being a few instances of more amateurish writing and wait times between chapters as of now. Overall rec. The Souls of Heroes is yet another story I decided to reread for this video, and was one of the few stories I had some remembrance of despite having read it 4 years ago. It's an 8.5, beyond decent, almost reaching good to good territory. It involves Shiro, Rin, and Saber getting shunted into Demon Souls, and from there the story focuses on action primarily with some character development. The only flaws I would attribute to it are a few misspellings and wrong words, some amateurish writing style, i.e. lots of short sentences in some chapters, and some small ass-fully plot developments. Personally, for a story which had 8 years of writing spent on it, I feel like it's kind of mandatory for an author to have removed all misspellings at least, if not dealt with the simple writing in some areas of the story. Overall though, solid. Note, the story was never marked as completed, despite it essentially being completed on both FF and Space Battles. The Space Battle title says completed it, just not a completed status, however. Chrono Dissociation is a fic involving Tracer contracting Archer due to a mishap which caused her to reach his reality marvel that's outside of time and space. The story goes from there and continues along a mystery on what happened to the moonlit world, and basically involves FGO. Overall, I would say personally for me it's an 8.5. It's pretty decent and close to reaching the good tier, but I'm not quite sure what's missing. The only things I could come up with are simply word count and more original stuff. Perhaps the story gets another 100 to 200k words in, I will have to bump it up to a 9 at least, regardless whether they add more original stuff to it. Solid recommendation, the Snark of Archer is on point in this one. The B Team is one I decided to randomly binge when making this video, just to see if there's another good go-to of it. The story is several of the beasts being summoned into Worm, and then begrudgingly working together to find out what's wrong with the timeline. The main critiques that could be raised are the writing assuming you are knowledgeable of Worm at times, and just general lack of word count. If this turns out to last several years and gets into the multiple hundreds of thousands of words, this could easily hit a 9 out of 10 for me, or even a flat 10. As of now, an 8.5, very enjoyable. 9 out of 10s, the ones that can be called good. And The Red Dragon Came by Kiwikipedia is a complete story of Li Shuin put into The Hobbit. The writing is good, very few grammar mistakes, and overall good plot and character development. The only drawbacks I would say is that I feel like the story relies on you being a fan of The Hobbit to fully enjoy, and potentially call a 10, as aspects of The Hobbit are glossed over, which I, as someone who's never really read it or seen it, would get. Another is the fact that I don't really have any standout memories or moments from the story, but overall still an overall good solid recommendation. Triumph with the Human Will is another complete story of Gurago being punted to the lands between. The plot, comedy, and characters are good, twists abound, and only 5 instances of grammar issues throughout. The only real flaws I would say are the story is written both flowery, which can be annoying and hard to parse at times, and can rely on you being aware of Elden Ring lore in order to have a fuller understanding of what's going on. On Space Battles, not marked as completed. For It Is in Passing That We Achieve Immortality might be a story that more realistically is an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10, but the story just hits right for me. John in Fate Arthurian times, where he ends up a friend of Mordred, a combo of relatively untouched Fate concepts. It's really good, and I have always enjoyed reading it. The only issue is the lengthy time between updates, and the story seems like it has its ending planned, and is on track to finishing in not too many chapters. A Ghost in a Strange Land is a God of War / Fate Grand Order crossover with Kratos becoming a Master of Caldea, as much as he dislikes it. Overall, a really good story. It makes use of both new characters and changed singularities. The only critiques I have are they skin the time in Caldea between singularities a lot, which leads out a lot of potential slice of life shenanigans, and this story heavily focuses on Kratos' POV, which can be tiring at times. Overall, solid recommendation, 9 out of 10. Heroes of Man is a crossover where essentially a singularity had formed that took 12 of the servants from Caldia and shunted them into the world of ASOIAF, an Imya sent to round them up. The story is good, has its creative original twist, and overall is very enjoyable to read. The only objective issues are the occasional grammar issue and the use of sound effects, but it's not too noticeable. A great story, 9 out of 10. To the Age of Gods is a Archer reincarnation into a Percy Jackson fic. It's actually a fic I got in early on a whim, and I have been extremely happy it didn't end up perma-hiatusing before hitting the 60k mark, and it's very good writing-wise. I basically have no complaints of it, except it's still in its early stages of plot relatively, and the encounters I'm waiting for don't seem to be coming anytime soon. When that happens, I could expect this to become a 10 for me, but as of now, put it at a 9. Strong recommendation. A Proper Band is a complete Fujimaru X Banana Oni slow burn slut fic. It's fucking peak content, highly recommend, a 9 or even 9.5 out of 10. Finally, the 10s out of 10s, the ones that are amazing. Hereafter, by James D. Fox, is, to be quite frank, exactly what an FGO fic should aim to do. Both new OC characters of historical figures and rewritten singularities, added with the extra cherry on top of the crossover aspect of Taylor from Worm, as an incredibly enjoyable MC to read from the perspective of. Add on the top, consistent and substantial content for the story. Overall, it's a work I have enjoyed reading for over 3 years now. The only critiques, if any, would be the author needing to be consistent with posting the little artwork for a story across all the platforms this is posted on, as well as needing to do more artwork in general for a story, especially when you're talking about new characters which aren't always that well described in the story. I have seen him dabble in AI concept art on a Sufficient Velocity thread, which isn't posted on his AO3 version of the story. In general, rule of thumb, most readers of web novels are positive or neutral on AI art being included, as it's still better than the usual, which is no art, so be consistent even if you are only doing concepts. Another potential improvement would be perhaps more chapters on the downtime between singularities, as it's usually brief. Overall though, amazing story. Must read. Mundatorum has 2 stories I believe are 10 out of 10s. First up is Demon in Fodland, where Gotia gets roped into helping at the academy. The story is my favorite fate fic at the moment. The writing is good, the character dynamics are fun, the story plot and drama is excellent, and the overall enjoyment is through the roof, with Gotia always being a blast to read. There's not any real complaints I have with it. The only improvement will perhaps be adding in art, but it's not really a necessary thing in a story with no new original characters. Second is Fate, Souls, and Singularities, where the Dark Souls series is an alternate timeline that's crossed over into FGO that's caused many figures from Dark Souls to be summonable as servants. The story has both creativity and coming up with new servants, both rewritten and new singularities, and the overall plot, which make it an extremely good read. The only critiques one could make are it having a somewhat rocky start, lack of combos / interactions of normal staff and servants outside of a couple instances, and the lack of art for a lot of characters who aren't really described all that well. I don't expect custom art when there's dozens of new characters, but it would be helpful to at least link existing art or shots of soul characters in-game to give readers an idea of what they look like alongside the rare times they are described in story. Excellent story, one I've enjoyed reading for several years now along with Demon in Fodland. Cannot recommend these 2 enough. Beyond Worlds by Marksman KNG is a complete fic with Archer being isekai'd, or in this case, reverse isekai'd into the world of recreators. Objectively, I can realize that my love for recreators has likely boosted my score of this, where otherwise, if I didn't know source material, I might have rated it lower. Regardless, when I read this last year, this gave me my fix of recreators I had been craving for 6 years at that point, with a story involving Archer that struck the exact same as the original anime, with no complaints to be had, besides occasional misspellings / incorrect words, and perhaps wishing it could be longer. All in all, a fantastic story, especially for anyone who is a fan of both series, a must-read. I would love to see this writer return with a new long Fate story in the future. Last, but not least, is Fate/Break Dawn, a fic where Archer, with memories of UBW and HF, is summoned by a mortal Artoria in a timeline involving an impossible Holy Grail war. It has some of the best writing and plot throughout the story, one example being the fight between Archer and Skaha, an exploration of something that is never really done in FGO despite the obvious connections, something that is fully realized here. A fantastic fic, one I cannot recommend enough, with the only flaw being the very rare instance of sound/anime effects being used. Wish it was updated more. I'm waiting to see my guess of multiple classes come into play as opposed to normal 7 is actually correct or not. Now, after all of those stories, and going on to almost 5 years experience in general with Fate fics, what is my general opinion on the state of Fate fanfiction? I would say it's lacking. Beyond the standard problem of hiatusing the works, there is a lot of stuff or story ideas that are simply never touched upon in long-form format. The one that annoys me the most is the complete lack of sci-fi crossovers of Fate. It's almost never tried, and the few times it is done, it's unfortunately usually done by someone who does not do it well. Man Off the Moon, an old Fate Extra Mass Effect crossover, was the exception, and a prime example of this done right, with the perfect writing excuse to make the story happen, which was allowing the Moon Cell to shift universes to avoid being targeted, as well as amazing writing in general that made me interested in ME fics for a while despite having never played the game. I honestly have no idea why this reason hasn't been stolen and used for more sci-fi crossovers in general. No one is going to complain about a writer taking a bit out of someone's playbook, as long as the story is an ass. Especially when it's far better an excuse than cell-rich trolling. And with most people being into Fate for the characters and not the strict lore rules, like this shouldn't be a thing. My only fear is that me saying, I want more sci-fi, is going to lead dudes over at spacebattles to say, I got you, bro, and proceed to only give me sci-fi or what I call the Big Six. That being Star Wars, Star Trek, 40K, Battletech, Mass Effect, and Halo. Granted, I do want actual Halo X Fate crossovers, as the market is basically non-existent, and a couple of stories that have popped up over the years are all Halo character summoned and past Holy Grail War, which is the exact opposite of what I want. I would kill for some relatively short story of about 100k words that focused on the events of Halo 1 and a low-powered servant such as Lord El Malloy II being summoned during that, or one of the other less written ones. There's a lot of wiggle room you could get with using the justification of bad circuits causing parameter debreaking, which would broaden the range of interesting characters one could use that wouldn't be broken, and various reasons you could use to justify a crossover that aren't too eye-rolling, like, I don't know, brief universe brushing against each other leading to a summoning. Unfortunately, as of right now, Bukharin's the only writer I know who's both a Fate and a Halo fan who has the knowledge and skill to pull that off, to the point where I'm half considering if I can ask, kiss, or con him into doing it. Oh, side note, since I assume some Fate fanfic writers are likely watching this, if you allow commissions, open up a Fiverr. I do not know what is the deal here with this precedent of using pay-power Ko-fi that essentially doxes you to a random internet stranger just to get a fanfic written. Back on track, however, when I say sci-fi crossovers, I also mean that this should be an opportunity to introduce people to lesser-known works, not just big names. This is also a problem in Fate fanfiction in general. There's a lot of stories of Fate characters and another big franchise, the prime example of this being the numerous Ruby crossovers of Fate. This behavior which likely is just due to authors wanting as wide of an audience as possible, has led to very little actual branching out, and using fanfiction to introduce people to lesser known works basically doesn't happen, which I personally feel should be a more widely held goal. I can also say that the use of more low fantasy settings and fate crossovers is also very sparse. I would kill for more stories in general of low-powered servants being summoned to worlds that they wouldn't be too broken in. One idea I've had recently was the idea of a character being summoned to Redwall, which could either stay for a while, then eventually jury-rig a way back, or potentially just die and become folklore. On the other hand, one could use a servant, who could be the historian of the Abbey, and last through the ages with both a slice of life and occasional combat focus, which could be a great long-form fic idea, but one that would require someone capable and willing of writing most likely a work that would span millions of words. And outside of a couple authors like James Fox or Mundatorum, I don't see anyone really having the chops for something that ambitious. In general, another problem is that a lot of servants, even some Part 1 servants, and God forbid, even mentioning characters from beyond Part 1, are basically non-existent when it comes to writing. Sure, some characters are very niche to find a good setting for, like Galati, yet others with fun personalities like Suzuka or Mandricardo would do amazing in getting more spotlight instead of the thousands Shiro/Archer fic. Not to mention that some characters have brain-dead obvious choices and plot ideas, like Elizabeth being shunted in Skyrim as a Dragonborn. Whereas Roman being isekai, it's wild to me that there isn't more done to this. But crossovers and isekais, while they may be a major focus of mine, are not the only places for improvement to be had. Fate fics taking place in the Fate universe also have their own areas of improvement. The main point that I touched on briefly before, but feel the need to reemphasize, is that writers should be creative and try adding their own original servants. This is especially the case for someone doing an FGO fic. Alongside original servants, someone who's writing an FGO fic should not only seek to improve the singularities, they should make their own story events if possible entirely. There are more points in history that could be used as events or even singularities than the game goes over. This should be heavily taken into account, especially when you consider a lot of the FGO stories retread the same old singularities, and taking your own spin on it is far more memorable than someone who retreads the same plot, a plot which a lot of people consider mid at best up until the 6th singularity. This goes double when you account for the fact that most FGO stories never get beyond Part 1. There is also the point to be made about tweaking rules or other things inside a story as well, due to some lore being, quite frankly, due to shit writing. Let's not forget about how Edison is supposed to encompass all the presidents, because apparently the US presidents aren't famous enough to qualify. Mind you, this is the same game that has shoehorned in Guda Guda events with no-name Japanese characters that nobody outside of Japan would have ever heard of year after year. In general, characters outside of Japan are underused, and this is bad even for American people. Davy Crockett, the well-loved congressman who died in the final stand of the Alamo, Mark Twain, the certified steamboat pilot who became touted as a founding father of American literature, who was friends with Tesla, and a self-proclaimed Morat and hater of monarchs, a direct opposite to a lot of the French characters. How are there more French servants than American ones? So much to choose from, and it's insane we only got like 5 official servants in America. There is also the fact that rarely goes spoken when it comes to Fate, that despite the author's intention on trying to use characters that are known from our history, that the Fate worlds are in fact AUs and have slightly different prior history compared to our own. One should consider making use of this and coming up with more original setting-based servants if possible. This could also touch on exploring the idea of old conceptual servants from little-known civilizations. Fate already has use of servants that are based off of fake concepts and not actual real historical people, like Sasaki and Nursery Rhyme. One could very easily make the idea of some old, nearly forgotten group of people, an example being of the people of who built Stonehenge and the Amesbury Archer in specific. Make a servant based on that, add in some more conceptual elements, behaviors, and beliefs to said servants, and it would fit very well with the current Fate servant system, while also giving readers the ability to see more servants of older civilizations that would otherwise be left untouched due to no specific person or figure being remembered for them. There's also the Shielder class, which is entirely unused because the writers for FGO don't want to do anything that could potentially sideline match as the Shielder. Such an ignored gold mine for servants. I actually haven't seen a single fic that added new Shielder characters. It's insane. There's more desire to do bland, insane, one-goal adventure characters, like Adventure Boudica, who I think I've seen twice now, than actual Shielders. As for more specific stories that are untouched, there's still a severe lack of human staff-focused ones, which could be done very well with a story that focuses on a staff character entirely and the employees and their interacts with each other, and inevitably the servants. This could be done with an SI trying to avoid scrutiny and detection, which could be an extremely good story written well. Reverse Isekai Slice of Life could also be good, and they haven't been done outside of Beyond Worlds, which was action focused. However, they can be very cringe if not written right. There is also the very underutilized aspect of that the islands in Fate had their Age of Gods last far longer, with the Mesoamericans lasting until 980. One could easily make use of perhaps Pacific Islands or Cuba lasting even longer than that for story ideas. There's also the fact that smut outside of small one-shots is very sparse. My condolences to the cunny-tards in the audience. There's actually jack shit for you. No idea why it's the case with Fate having some of the best designed girls, but regardless, either satisfy yourself with the handful of small one-shots that exist in the English side, or settle for translated dojins. Then again, there's probably something better on the JP side of fanfiction, but unless you are willing to deep out translate, I hesitate to tell you to try that, as I have essentially no experience with it. This is without even addressing the elephant in the room of the Honkai Star Rail collab, which will likely only exacerbate this issue, with little improvements to the overall Fate fanfiction ecosystem. Granted, my expectation here is due to the brief foray I did into Genshin Impact as sci-fiction. Perhaps the Star Rail community has better fanfic writers, but I'm not holding my breath. Overall, there's a lot of free real estate when it comes to potential ideas, which leads me to dangle the carrot under anyone with the will and passable talent who's watching. You should be aware that a lot of prominent Fate fanfic writers who have Patreons do make sizable chunk change, which if you are a third worlder, might be more than just chunk change. Don't hesitate on getting in on the ground floor now and getting what you can, especially when there's no telling when this market will essentially disappear as AI gets better in the years to come. If Nim the writer, the dude who I think is entirely mid, can get almost 2,000 people subscribed to his Patreon and likely a solid living off it, I'm sure some of you can get some people with simply decent writing on your end. If you have issues with doing decent writing, my genuine suggestion is to read some of the Wandering Inn and take a look at how the writing is done there. There's very rarely instances of small line of dialogue followed one after another. Characters are always shown doing other stuff, or there's always something that makes it not still reading what's happening. This is a bit of advice a lot of Fate fanfic writers could use to improve their stories substantially, and if you aren't even able to channel even a bit of that writing, you should be able to make a decent story, or at worst a fine story, assuming you aren't completely fucking up other areas like the plot or character behaviors. That's all I have to say about Fate's English fanfiction, at least for now. If you have any recommendations for me, feel free to post in the comments below. Do not wreck Fringe or Trash, no Harry Potter out of principle regardless of quality, no DxD either unless you're willing to bet your soul that I'll like it. I plan on coming back in maybe a couple years time and either give a new video or I hope to dive into the pool of Japanese Fate fanfiction over that period and give some recs, or at least some updates to what's changed in the English side. As for more general Fate stuff, I want to read Fate Lost Einherjar, probably butchering that, which got a fan translation of the first novel a couple months back, which I found out about during this video. I want to do a short 2 to 3 minute review of that, get that out sometime in next month, especially since it has very little discussion on YouTube. Maybe finally actually try Strange Fate as well as the various Fate mangas. Perhaps I might make a quick video on Fate Samurai Remnant. I finally finished watching an LP of that and its 3 DLCs, as well as the FGO event, and I have lots on that game when it's quality. I could also do one on Fate Empire Dirt, and I found this fanfic visual novel on YouTube by Sir Reed again, called Fate/Unchained Rebellion, that I want to take a look at. I'm also toying with the idea of a short informative video on Fate merch. Just spent a few days looking at that and diving in, and considering the last video that talked about Fate merch in general seems to have been like half a decade ago, perhaps that could be a decent video topic. If you have any to put in the comments below, I would prefer to avoid doing slop/niche lore content, as a lot of Fate content creators seem to do. So unless I get good suggestions, I would likely turn my focus back to more isekai related stuff, as well as a couple more general videos. Speaking of my content in the future, this video took over 3 months of my free time to complete. So, due to both laziness, as well as general lack reception of my prior yearly isekai video, I'm not making an isekai yearly roundup for this year. I have in mind to do simple kind of shitposty videos on Time Stop Hero, as well as my problem with Gyaro manga. Brownie points, you can guess what that is. Since I can now narrate myself, I can actually do more than the simple or relatively monotone narration that my prior videos have been. So, that is my current video schedule idea. Fate Lost Einherjar, Time Stop Hero, and my problem with Gyaro manga being essentially what's guaranteed. I also want to do a short to medium-ish video on Etotama, a severely underrated show in its current state. Some more potential long videos in the considerable future will either be catching up on Cooking with Wild Game, finally delving into Mushoku Tensei, or doing a video going over either monster girl fiction or reverse sexual morality fiction. If any of that sounds interesting, I'm sure you're smart enough to figure out what to do. If you care to know the best fanfic/web novel sites, you can check out my prior video on the English web novel sites. Otherwise, until next time,